I want you to imagine, just for a second, the most utterly ordinary, unremarkable part of a daily commute.
Right.
We are talking about a commuter ferry. It is a vessel of pure routine, you know?
Yeah, totally.
If you picture the inside, you are seeing tired office workers staring at their phones. Maybe some tourists crowding the outer decks, snapping photos, people sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups while they read the morning news.
Just another Tuesday morning.
Exactly. It's basically a city bus that just happens to float.
It's designed entirely for predictability. I mean, point A to point B across calm, familiar waters.
Yeah.
It's a piece of civic infrastructure that blends completely into the background noise of everyday urban life. You don't look at a commuter ferry and think of international conflict.
You really don't.
Yeah.
But what happens when you take that exact same ship, that mundane, slow-moving commuter ferry, and you suddenly drop it right into one of the most volatile geopolitical hotspots on the entire planet?
Well, everything changes.
Because overnight, that predictable city bus of the sea became the flashpoint for an international military incident. It became a massive diplomatic crisis and, honestly, a story that fundamentally fractured our modern understanding of maritime law.
It is the absolute definition of a paradigm shift. We're taking a vessel built for nothing but routine transit and thrusting it into a situation of extreme, unprecedented friction.
Right.
And the resulting collision wasn't just physical, it was a collision of narratives, of legal frameworks, and of international relations.
That is exactly what we are unpacking on this deep dive. We are looking at the MV Mavi Marmara.
Mavi Marmara, yeah.
This is a Comoros-flagged passenger ship that ended up becoming the lead vessel in the incredibly infamous 2010 Gaza Freedom Flotilla. But before we get into the timeline, I want to set a very strict parameter for what we are doing today.
This is super important, yeah.
Our mission today is to navigate an event that is incredibly complex and deeply, deeply charged.
And that requires a very specific approach from us as we look at this. The source materials we're analyzing contain deeply polarizing, heavily disputed political content.
Absolutely.
The narratives surrounding this event are contradictory and often mutually exclusive depending on who you ask.
So to be absolutely clear with you listening right now, we're not taking sides.
No?
We are not endorsing any specific political viewpoints, and we are not here to judge the actors involved on either side of this geopolitical conflict. Our sole objective today is to impartially unpack the facts.
Just the facts.
Right, to lay out the competing narratives and to examine the very murky legal frameworks presented in our sources. We're acting entirely as your guides through the information, trying to understand how this actually happened.
It is crucial to maintain that analytical distance, because the moment you abandon that objectivity, you lose the ability to see the incredible structural and legal complexities of what actually took place out there in the Mediterranean.
I agree completely. But before we get to the dark waters of the Mediterranean, before the military helicopters and the diplomatic fallout, I really want to look at the physical ship itself.
Hardware.
Yeah, because how a municipal ferry gets drafted into a blockade-running flotilla is a logistical puzzle in itself.
Yeah.
I mean, the Mavi Marmara did not start its life as a protest vessel.
Not at all. Its origins couldn't be more conventional, honestly. The ship was built back in 1994 by the Turkish shipbuilding company.
Okay.
Specifically, it was constructed at the Golden Gate shipyard. And for years and years, it was owned and operated by IHH Istanbul fast ferries.
And its daily existence was just ferrying up to, what, like 1,000 people?
Up to 1,080 passengers at a time, yeah. Around the Sea of Marmara.
Wow.
It ran a highly regular route, starting at Sarıburnu in Istanbul, heading out to Marmara Island, and then over to Afsa Island. It was an absolute workhorse.
When you look at the specifications of a ship designed to carry over 1,000 people, you are talking about a significant piece of heavy infrastructure.
Oh, massive.
We are looking at a vessel that is 93 meters long. That is almost 300 feet.
Basically the length of a football field.
Right. And it has a gross tonnage of over 4,100. So it is not some nimble little speedboat that can zigzag through the water and evade capture.
No, not at all.
It's a substantial, top-heavy passenger vessel designed to carry dense crowds safely at relatively modest speeds, averaging about 7.2 knots.
Which is practically crawling if you're comparing it to military vessels.
Let me stop you there, because that physical description makes what happens in 2010 seem even more bizarre to me. In 2010, the ship's destiny completely changes. It is purchased for $800,000.
Yep.
But the sources note this wasn't a corporate acquisition. That entire $800,000 was raised through public donations.
Crowdfunded.
Yeah. Why did they have to crowdfund the outright purchase of a massive ship? Couldn't an organization just charter a vessel for a few weeks to deliver aid? I mean, renting seems easier.
Well, that's where the realities of commercial shipping collide with geopolitical activism. The organizers of the flotilla initially tried to charter a vessel.
Oh, they did.
They did, but absolutely no commercial ship owner was willing to risk their asset on this journey. Commercial shipping is an entirely risk-averse industry driven by insurance underwriters.
I mean, I guess it's like crowdfunding the purchase of a city bus because you want to drive it directly into a demilitarized zone.
Exactly.
And the rental companies are looking at you saying, yeah, we were not giving you a vehicle for that. The liability is insane.
It really is. The moment you, as a ship captain or an owner, declare your explicit intention to challenge a military blockade, your maritime insurance is voided instantly.
Wow.
Instantly. Pretty much. Your commercial viability drops to zero, and the risk of physical loss of the ship, whether that's through damage, confiscation, or impoundment, becomes incredibly high.
Right.
No underwriter in London or anywhere else is going to cover that, so the organizers had to buy the ship outright. They had to own the entirety of the financial and physical risk themselves.
Which leaves us with a ship that is fundamentally just glass, steel, and passenger seating. How does a civilian ferry actually prepare for a mission to break a naval blockade?
That's the thing.
It's not like they could install armor plating or military radar.
Right, they didn't even try to. And that vulnerability is central to the whole strategy. They weren't trying to build a warship to win a naval battle.
Right, they couldn't win that anyway.
Exactly. The preparation was entirely logistical and optical. It was about loading it with humanitarian aid, coordinating hundreds of activists from dozens of different countries, and setting up a massive media broadcasting apparatus on board.
Oh, so they were planning to broadcast the whole thing.
Yeah. The strategy wasn't to physically overpower a military blockade. The strategy was to make the optical and political cost of stopping a civilian ferry so high that the military would just be forced to let them through.
I see. But a ship is just a tool, you know?
Right.
It's just metal. The element that truly sets the stage for the crisis is the organization that actually bought the Mavi Marmara.
Right, the IHH.
And when I was going through the sources for this deep dive, the whiplash I got reading about this group was intense. They seem to have two wildly, almost impossibly different international reputations.
This is where the story becomes a fascinating case study in how geopolitics shapes reality. The organization that purchased the ship was the IHH. That stands for the Humanitarian Relief Foundation.
Oh.
It is a Turkish non-governmental organization, an NGO.
Let's lay out the first narrative then, which is heavily focused on their humanitarian credentials.
Sure.
On paper, their standing in that space is massive. They operate as a charity in over 115 countries. And crucially, since 2004, they've held special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council.
And I should clarify what that UN ECOSOC status actually means, because it's not just a ceremonial certificate you hang on a wall.
Right. It sounds official, but what does it do?
Holding special consultative status gives an NGO a formal institutional relationship with the United Nations. It allows them to designate official representatives to the UN headquarters, attend public meetings of the council, and even submit written statements relevant to the UN's work.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, it confers a highly significant degree of international legitimacy and vetting. You don't just get that status overnight.
And they were leveraging that legitimacy, right?
Yeah.
For this specific flotilla, they received very public endorsements from towering figures in the global peace sector.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
Yeah.
We're talking about Mary Corrigan Maguire, who is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate.
Massive names.
Yeah, these are heavy hitters throwing their full weight behind the IHH and this specific mission. If you only look at that side of the ledger, the IHH appears to be a globally recognized UN-affiliated humanitarian heavyweight.
But then you open the second file,
Yeah.
and the contrast is so stark, it's almost disorienting.
It really is, because alongside the Nobel laureates and the UN status, the sources detail incredibly heavy terrorism allegations.
Yes.
For instance, the German branch of the IHH is actively classified as a terrorist organization by both Israel and Holland.
And the allegations go deep into the mechanics of international finance, too.
Yeah.
There are alleged financial ties between the IHH and an entity called the Union of Good.
Hold on, what is the Union of Good? I haven't heard of them.
The Union of Good is an umbrella organization that was designated as a specially designated global terrorist organization by the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. This was done under Executive Order 13224.
Okay, let me pause you there because OFAC is a term that gets thrown around a lot in financial news. But how does that actually impact an NGO in practice?
Well, OFAC is the Financial Intelligence and Enforcement Agency of the U.S. Treasury Department.
Okay.
When they designate an entity under that executive order, it means the U.S. government believes the organization is financing terrorism. It freezes their assets within U.S. jurisdiction and effectively locks them out of the global Western banking system.
So it completely cuts off their money supply.
Pretty much. So having alleged ties to an OFAC-designated entity is a massive red flag for Western intelligence agencies.
And it wasn't just financial rumors, right? In 2010, the U.S. State Department spokesman, P.J. Crowley, publicly expressed great concern over the IHH's alleged links to senior Hamas officials.
Yes.
And the claims from Israel were even more aggressive.
Yeah. The Israeli Intelligence and Terrorism Information Center, which our sources note has very close ties to the Israeli Defense Forces, they allege that the IHH actively supports terrorism, has been involved in smuggling arms, and even has links to global jihadist networks like al-Qaeda.
I read that and thought, well, maybe that's just the opposing side in a conflict throwing accusations, typical wartime propaganda.
Right, which happens all the time.
But the sources also cite a 2012 report from the Turkish daily Haberturk, noting that Turkish legal authorities themselves were investigating one of the key figures behind the flotilla.
Femi Bülent Yildirim.
Yes, investigating him for allegedly transferring funds to al-Qaeda from his own government.
It really forces you to grapple with a profound contradiction. How does an organization navigate the global stage when it is simultaneously holding UN consultative status and being investigated for funding al-Qaeda? It's wild.
And naturally, the IHH pushed back hard against this.
Of course.
IHH Turkey explicitly denied any links to the German branch of the organization. Greta Berlin, a director of the Free Gaza movement, went on the record calling these claims utterly scurrilous.
Right.
Her argument was that these terrorism allegations were nothing more than a calculated bad faith disinformation campaign by the Israeli government to discredit a legitimate human rights movement.
It highlights the extreme complexity of international NGO operations in conflict zones. I mean, the exact same organization with the exact same funding streams and logistical operations is interpreted entirely differently depending on which side of a geopolitical fault line you are standing on. For one side, they are delivering essential life-saving aid. For the other, they are providing material support to hostile entities under the guise of charity.
It is the ultimate Rorschach test. And with this deeply polarizing organization at the helm, the Mavi Marmara leaves the mundane world of municipal transit behind and heads straight into a geopolitical storm.
Point of no return.
Yeah, in late May 2010, it officially becomes the flagship of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla.
And this wasn't just a solo run. The flotilla is a highly coordinated effort made up of multiple ships carrying activists from 37 different countries.
37 countries, that's a huge international footprint.
It really is. Their stated, highly publicized goal was to physically confront and break the Israeli naval blockade of the Gaza Strip to deliver their cargo of aid.
Because they were so public about their intentions, the military response was waiting for them.
I knew exactly what was coming.
And this leads to the standoff. Let's look at the timeline here. It's May 30, 2010. The flotilla is en route. But they have not yet reached the blockade zone. They are still sailing in international waters.
This is the moment of first contact. The Israeli naval forces initiate communications with the flotilla. They broadcast a very clear formal message stating that a naval blockade over the Gaza area is in force.
Right.
And they issue a strict ultimatum: change your course, follow the Navy to the Ashdod port in Israel, where the aid will be inspected and delivered over land, or face being boarded by military forces.
And the organizers on the Mavi Marmara refuse. They decline the order, and they explicitly cite the fact that they are currently sailing in international waters, not Israeli territorial waters, and not within the formally declared blockade zone.
Right. They believe that their location gave them absolute legal immunity from military interception.
See, this is exactly what I don't understand. If a ship is flying a sovereign flag, like the Comoros flag in this case, in international waters, how is a military force ordering them to change course not legally classified as piracy?
That's a great question.
I thought the entire concept of the high seas was freedom of navigation, completely jurisdiction-free. How can a Navy order you to turn around before you've actually crossed the invisible line into a blockade?
That is the core legal friction of this entire event. On one hand, you're absolutely right. The principle of freedom of the high seas is foundational to maritime law. Generally, a ship in international waters is subject only to the jurisdiction of the nation whose flag it flies.
Right. So intercepting them seems like a massive illegal overreach.
It does seem that way. But the law of naval warfare introduces a very specific exception. When a formal naval blockade is established, military forces operate under guidelines often derived from customary international law and documents like the San Remo Manual on International Law applicable to armed conflicts at sea.
Wait, pause for a second. The San Remo Manual. Is that a binding global treaty everyone signed or just a guidebook?
It's a highly influential document drafted in 1994 by international legal and naval experts. It isn't a binding treaty in the way the Geneva Conventions are, but it is widely considered to represent customary international law.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Meaning it codifies the rules that state navies generally accept and practice as legally binding during armed conflicts, even if it's not a formal treaty they signed.
Okay, so what does customary law say about stopping a ship in international waters?
It says that a blockading force can intercept a neutral vessel outside the immediate blockade zone if that vessel has clearly and publicly established its intention to breach the blockade.
Oh, I see.
Think of it structurally like a restraining order. If someone publicly announces they are driving to a location to violate a court order, law enforcement can intercept them on the highway miles away.
Right, they don't have to wait.
Exactly. They don't have to wait for the person to put their foot over the property line if the intent is unambiguous. And the flotilla had spent weeks holding press conferences declaring their explicit intent to breach the blockade.
So the military's argument is, we know exactly where you are going. You've told the whole world what you're planning to do, so we have the legal right to stop you here and now.
Precisely. But knowing the legal argument doesn't lessen the immense psychological tension of the standoff itself.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
Put yourself on the bridge of the Mavi Marmara on the night of May 30. It's pitch black. You are on the open sea. You are surrounded by activists and journalists.
Right.
You believe you have the absolute moral and legal right to be there, and you are being hailed by one of the most advanced, heavily armed militaries in the world, telling you to surrender your vessel.
And because the activists refused to turn around, the Israeli military faced a ticking clock. If they waited until daylight or until the ship actually crossed into the blockade zone closer to the coast, the media optics of a daytime interception would be broadcast live.
Yeah, that would be a PR nightmare for them.
Exactly. And the proximity to the shore could complicate the naval maneuvers. They felt they had to act under the cover of darkness. That brings us to 2 a.m. on May 31st, 2010.
The refusal to divert meant the standoff was over. A physical confrontation was now inevitable. The gears of a military operation were in motion, and it was going to happen in the dark, in international waters, on a crowded 300-foot civilian ferry.
The sources state that the boarding operation began at 2 a.m., and it took until 8 a.m. to complete.
That is a long time.
That is 6 hours of absolute chaos.
Yeah.
Let's really look at the mechanics of this operation, because how do you even board a ship that size when it doesn't want you to?
Well, the Israeli military deployed Shayat 13 commandos.
What kind of unit is that? Are they like regular infantry?
No, Shayat 13 is the elite naval special forces unit of the Israeli Navy. Their operational purview typically involves maritime hostage rescue, counterterrorism, deep water sabotage, and stealth insertions.
Oh, wow. So like their version of the Navy SEALs.
Very much so. They are highly trained for close quarters battle.
So you have top-tier commandos going up against a civilian ferry packed with activists.
Yes, but the logistics of the insertion were incredibly dangerous regardless. They initiated a simultaneous boarding. Speedboats pulled up alongside the massive hull of the Mavi Marmara, attempting to hook ladders onto the sides.
Okay.
At the exact same time, military helicopters hovered directly over the top decks, and commandos began fast roping down onto the ship.
Just the physics of that is terrifying. It's 2 a.m., pitch black out there. The ferry is moving at 7 knots, pitching in the water. The roar of the ship's engines is competing with the deafening sound of helicopter rotors just feet above the deck.
Throwing water everywhere.
Yeah, water is churning everywhere. And into this sensory overload, soldiers are sliding down ropes onto a deck packed with people.
And the dispute over how the violence actually started in those first few seconds is heavily contested in our sources.
Who fired first, essentially?
Exactly. According to reports from journalists who were on the ship, and crucially, according to the subsequent United Nations report on the incident, the Israeli military opened fire with live rounds before they even physically set foot on the deck of the ship.
But the military's counter-narrative is that the commandos were met with immediate, life-threatening violence the second they began descending the ropes,
Right.
which they say necessitated the immediate use of force to survive the landing.
Right.
But regardless of exactly when the first shot cracked through the air, what unfolded on the deck of that ship was a violently chaotic clash.
It was. The sources are unequivocal that the passengers on the ship actively attempted to thwart the landing. This was not a sit-in. This was not passive resistance.
Not at all.
As the commandos came down the ropes and climbed up the sides, they were met with hand-to-hand combat and armed chaos.
And we really need to examine the weapons involved here because this speaks to the sheer asymmetry of the clash. The UN report detailed the specific weapons found on board afterwards.
Yeah, what did they find?
They found kitchen knives, plus one traditional ceremonial knife. They found catapults, which we would normally refer to as slingshots. And they found metal pipes.
It's important to note how those metal pipes were acquired, too. The sources specifically state that the passengers had actively used angle grinders or saws to cut those heavy metal pipes from the ship's own structural railings to arm themselves against the boarding party.
See, I think a lot of people might hear metal pipes and slingshots and think, well, compared to an elite commando with an assault rifle, that's not a real threat.
That is a fundamental misunderstanding of close quarters battle.
Right.
In the confined space of a ship's deck, in the dark, an iron pipe swung at a soldier who is dangling from a rope or just hitting the deck is absolutely a lethal threat. Blunt force trauma to the head or neck can be instantly fatal.
So the military rules of engagement just disintegrate.
The escalation curve in that environment is almost vertical. The military rules of engagement in a situation like that break down incredibly fast because the soldiers perceive an immediate threat to their lives.
It's life or death for them in that second.
Right. The transition from utilizing non-lethal crowd control tactics like paintballs or stun grenades to using lethal firearms happens in a fraction of a second. The sheer asymmetry of the weapons actually contributes to the lethality of the chaos.
Because they have to use what they have.
Exactly. Heavily armed commandos, when cornered or attacked with blunt force, will use their firearms to neutralize the threat. It's what they are trained to do.
And the cost of that chaos was devastating. By the time the ship was finally secured at 8 a.m., the casualties were severe. 9 activists were killed immediately during the clash.
Awful.
The sources also note that a 10th activist died 4 years later in 2014 from the wounds he sustained that night.
The human toll was immense. In addition to the fatalities, several dozen activists were injured, many of them seriously.
Yeah.
On the military side of the clash, 10 Israeli soldiers were injured, with one reported to be in serious condition.
It is a staggering amount of violence on what used to be a commuter ferry. And once the guns eventually went silent, the battle didn't actually end. It just immediately shifted arenas.
A different battlefield.
Yeah, it moved from the blood-stained deck of the ship directly into the halls of international courts and diplomatic chambers.
In the aftermath of a lethal incident involving a sovereign flag, international waters, and foreign nationals, the international community demands answers, obviously.
Of course.
But what resulted was a perfect example of how different investigative bodies can look at the exact same physical timeline, the exact same coordinates, and the exact same casualty list, and arrive at fundamentally opposing legal and moral conclusions.
Let's break down these competing investigations because it's a duel of reports. First, you have the United Nations report. They investigated and confirmed the tragic deaths.
Yes.
But they also confirmed the use of those improvised weapons, the pipes, the knives, by the passengers. So the UN officially acknowledges the active physical resistance by the activists.
Then you have the national reports, which diverge sharply based on geopolitical alignment. Turkey unveiled its final report on the incident in February 2011. And as you might expect, the Turkish report was heavily critical of Israel. It viewed the boarding in international waters and the lethal force used as a gross, indefensible violation of international law and human rights.
But then, just a month earlier, in January 2011, you had the Turkey Commission. This was a government-appointed public commission in Israel, and their findings were the exact opposite.
It's completely different.
Yeah, the Turkey Commission found that both the initial naval blockade of Gaza itself and the specific use of force by the Israeli soldiers during the boarding of the Mavi Marmara were entirely legal under international law.
And we must note that it wasn't just internal Israeli legal justification either. The sources cite independent legal backing for this stance as well.
Who was that?
Professor Andrzej Matowski, a Polish authority on admiralty law, published an extensive article in the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs in 2013. He also upheld the legality of the Israeli actions, basing his argument firmly on the established laws of armed conflict at sea.
Okay, this leaves me incredibly confused about how international maritime law actually functions. You have the UN, Turkey, Israel, and independent legal scholars all looking at the exact same set of facts.
Same exact event.
How does the law even function if it is this subjective? I thought the law was supposed to provide a definitive answer, like it's either legal or illegal.
This exposes an incredible vulnerability in international law, specifically regarding the concept of proportional force. International humanitarian law dictates that a military force can only use force that is proportional to the military advantage anticipated and proportional to the threat faced.
But how do you objectively measure proportionality here? How do you weigh an elite commando with an assault rifle against an activist with an iron pipe cut from a handrail? What is the math there?
You've hit on the exact reason these reports diverge so wildly. It is incredibly difficult. Proportionality in self-defense law requires that the response matches the threat. If a soldier faces lethal blunt force trauma, lethal ballistic force is technically a proportional defensive response. But maritime law was largely written for conflicts between state navies, battleships fighting battleships, or for dealing with piracy.
Oh, that makes sense. State versus state.
Exactly. It struggles immensely to handle asymmetrical confrontations where civilian activism intentionally intersects with military operations.
The legal frameworks are just not built for this kind of modern activism.
They aren't robust enough to provide a universally accepted answer when the waters are this muddy. The law ends up relying on interpretation, and interpretation is almost always colored by underlying geopolitical allegiances.
And while all these lawyers, politicians, and commissions spent years arguing over the paperwork, the legal theory, and the exact definition of proportionality, the physical ship itself, the Mavi Marmara, was left bearing the very real, very physical scars of this incident.
The aftermath for the vessel itself is a stark physical reminder of the reality of that night. On July 23, 2010, the Israeli government finally decided to release the 3 ships that made up the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, which had been impounded for months at the ports of Haifa and Ashdod.
But the Mavi Marmara couldn't just fire up its engines and sail home. It was severely damaged.
Yeah, it wasn't seaworthy on its own.
3 Turkish tugboats had to be dispatched across the Mediterranean to retrieve the flotilla. The Mavi Marmara was hooked up to a tugboat named the Ocean Ergun. It was dragged in a slow 2-day tow across the sea, finally arriving at the port of Iskenderun in Turkey on August 7.
And when it arrived, it wasn't treated like a returning hero. It was treated entirely as a crime scene. Nobody was permitted to board initially because Turkish public prosecutors were conducting their forensic investigation.
Makes sense.
But even from the dock, the damage was blindingly obvious. Pictures were released to the press showing broken windows and bullet holes that had completely shattered the thick glass of the ship's pilot house.
The forensic discoveries are chilling when you remember this used to be a commuter ferry. According to Turkish news reports cited in our sources, the forensic teams identified approximately 250 bullet holes across the ship.
250 bullet holes on a passenger vessel.
It's crazy.
The density of the crossfire must have been staggering.
Yeah. But then comes another layer of intense controversy. There were immediate claims of a cover-up regarding those bullet holes.
Right, the painting incident.
Turkish news alleged that many of those holes had been actively painted or plastered over by the Israelis before the ship was towed back. And highly symbolically, the IHH emblem, a massive logo of the organization that owned the ship, which was painted on the port side, had been entirely painted over in stark white paint.
The erasure of the logo and the patching of the bullet holes served only to inflame the diplomatic situation further.
Oh, I'm sure it did.
Whether it was standard maritime procedure to clean a vessel before returning it, or a deliberate, calculated attempt to sanitize the evidence. It was perceived by Turkey as an attempt to literally paint over history.
Despite the damage and the controversy, the ship did eventually make it back to its home port. On December 26, 2010, the Mavi Marmara finally returned to Istanbul harbor.
And it was a massive, emotional event.
The sources describe a welcoming ceremony attended by thousands of cheering people. It had left as a crowd-funded ferry and returned as a global symbol of resistance.
But its days as an active protest vessel were over. The coalition of NGOs immediately started planning a sequel, Freedom Flotilla II, which was scheduled to sail in June 2011.
Okay.
And initially, the Mavi Marmara was supposed to be the flagship leading the charge once again.
But they had to pull the plug on that plan, didn't they?
They did. By mid-June, it was announced that the Mavi Marmara would not be sailing. The physical damage sustained during the raid was just too severe to repair in time.
Wow.
The IHH released a statement saying that the ship was simply not in a condition to put to sea safely. It was sidelined by its own scars.
And those physical scars mirrored the geopolitical reality of the region perfectly, because the most significant macro effect of the Mavi Marmara incident wasn't maritime law. It was the complete and utter breakdown of diplomatic relations between Israel and Turkey.
Which is huge because historically, those two nations had significant strategic, military, and economic ties. They were regional allies.
Yes, and they completely severed their relationship over what happened on the deck of that one ship.
Over a few hours in the dark.
I keep going back to the image of those painted-over bullet holes. It's such a perfect, depressing metaphor for the whole situation. You try to physically plaster over the damage, you slap some white paint on the hull to make it look clean again, but underneath, the structural integrity is totally compromised.
Yeah, the damage is still there.
Trying to physically erase the damage only highlighted how deep and permanent the diplomatic damage was between the two nations. It took until a formal agreement in 2016, 6 full years later, just to begin recovering those international relations.
It is a profound testament to the power of a single, localized event. A conflict on the deck of one ship, lasting only a few hours, sent diplomatic shockwaves across the entire global stage that lasted for years.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We've gone from a mundane, predictable ferry road in the Sea of Marmara to the chaotic center of a geopolitical earthquake.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
The Mavi Marmara was designed and built to ferry everyday people across calm, predictable waters. Instead, it became a global symbol of the intense, often violent friction between civilian activism and military sovereignty. In our current era of hyper-global interconnectedness, where NGOs have massive reach and conflicts are broadcast in real time, it asks us to deeply consider a very uncomfortable question.
What's the question?
When exactly does a civilian protest vessel cross the invisible line into becoming a legitimate military target? And perhaps more importantly, in a world governed by subjective international law, who ultimately gets to draw that line?
It's a question without an easy answer. But in a world where civilians are increasingly stepping into conflict zones, it's one we have to keep asking. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives behind the headlines, and we will catch you next time.